that's kind of distally located or far away from the original expansion of the soy area, but the evidence is a little bit unclear. Important questions that have to be resolved to really answer this question include, where did the cattle that were previously using a new soy area go? Did the owner move his ranching? Did the owner actually move his ranching operation to the frontier? Did he consolidate onto some other area that he was already using and maybe increase the stocking rate, thereby not causing indirect deforestation? Did he stop ranching altogether? These are questions that we still have to answer. So that's kind of the state of the science at the landscape level as far as the soy moratorium. So then the next phase of our research, we wanted to try to understand, going back to that finding that 5 times the number of soy farmers violated the forest code than violated the soy moratorium. We wanted to try to understand what on earth those producers were doing with that area. If they were clearing it and not using it for soy production, what in the world were they doing? And then we also wanted to try to understand a little bit more how soy farmers are experiencing the emergence and implementation of all these new requirements from the people that buy their soy. Are they just complying? How do they find out what the requirements are? Do they have other strategies and options that aren't accounted for under the type of governance that controls land use for soy production? Just basically kind of getting at how do we better explain the process by which the landscape level results that we're seeing are taking place from a producer perspective. And then we were hoping that all of this information would give us a little bit more insight into how durable the soy moratorium is, or how durable the concept of keeping the soy supply chain free of deforestation might be. These questions are all particularly important right now because the soy moratorium is set to expire in May of 2016. So if the soy moratorium is indeed playing this really key role in reducing deforestation, we need to be able to explain really well how, in fact, that's happening to either maintain the soy moratorium in the future or to inform whatever kinds of policies might be put into place to replace it. Doing this required zooming in to see exactly what producers are up to. And so this means that most of the results for the final part of this talk and for this particular phase of our research is coming from field interviews. And so far, since we've been going out into the field periodically since 2013, and so far we've talked to 100 producers, or 100 people, about 88 producers, in these 4 municipalities here in this part of Mato Grosso. Primarily because I used to live in the middle of this yellow part and I wanted to see what was going on here in these areas where soy is more rapidly expanding. Here is a fairly consolidated area. There's not that much land use change taking place. Soy properties that we visited ranged from about 200 hectares to over 10,000 hectares to give you a sense of the scope, the scale of production that we're talking about. These are really enormous farms. In fact, a 200-hectare farm can barely make a living producing soy in the Amazon. We spoke to either the owner or the renter or the manager, basically whoever was at the farm when we showed up, who said that they had some sort of responsibility for soy production. And we were out looking for information about how long the producer had been on the land. Was he a new user? Had somebody else been there using the land before him? What happened to that person? How many properties did the producer have? Do they own these properties? Do they rent these properties? Like, how how familiar are they with major policies that affect their production? These kinds of things. And so the first thing we found, which was really surprising to us, was that integration of soy and cattle production is quite common. It's occurring at fairly high rates. This is a really interesting finding because soy production and cattle ranching are pretty much widely viewed in the literature that's out there that these in the Amazon, these are really separate production systems. Although recently there have been a lot of calls from from agronomists and other kinds of researchers that integrating soy and cattle production in kind of a rotation system or similar would be a really important way to improve the efficiency of food production in the Amazon without needing additional deforestation. So we were really surprised to find that of the properties that we visited, 19% were already doing this. And then when you took into account people that owned a lot of different properties, nearly a third of producers were already engaged in both kinds of production. Our results are not the result, didn't come from randomized sampling, so we can't infer that these are the rates that would apply across the entire Amazon, but they do suggest that at least in some pockets, this is a really important phenomenon of note. that's already taking place. So in nearly all cases, the people that we talked to that had this integration going on were not soy farmers who took up ranching, but the opposite. They were ranchers who had taken up soy farming. And this directionality in the trend is really important for understanding what's going on in the Amazon production landscape today. So as I mentioned, I think earlier, soy production is the most profitable agricultural activity in this part of the Amazon. But for most people, unless you're just really rich, it requires substantial amounts of credit from the outset of each season, and then also longer-term credit lines for things like tractors and stuff. So at the beginning of each season, most farmers are buying seeds and fertilizers and pesticides on credit. And then, of course, financing tractors and harvesters, which can cost, $200,000 usually, which is just a ton of money. Cattle ranching in the Amazon is somewhat less capitalized. Ranchers typically don't have access to any kinds of credit line except for through the government, and ranchers in the Amazon typically don't take out these credit lines to supplement their pastures or fertilizer or anything like this. They typically operate on a non-credit basis, just raising the cattle the best they can and then selling to a slaughterhouse. Whereas soy producers have access to all kinds of financing, including from the traders that buy their soy. And so a really common way for someone involved in soy production to finance basically anything is to take out a package or a contract up front with a trader, with which sometimes they just get a direct shipment of whatever inputs they need for their farming in exchange for the future contract on the soy that they're going to produce with those inputs. But then sometimes they can get cash up front as well. And so this is a major shift in the way that cattle ranchers may be getting access to credit in a way that they haven't before. It also, even more importantly than this integration of soy and cattle ranching signals that at least some ranchers aren't selling their properties and moving to the frontier like that schematic of indirect land use change that I showed you would indicate if we were applying that concept to the land use change in the Amazon. It means that ranchers are staying put, perhaps, and instead of when their pasture becomes degraded, moving onto the frontier, they're finding ways to improve their pasture with planting soy production, which is a way to both fertilize your eventual pasture land and also make some money in the meantime because you can sell the soy. It also provides a potential explanation for the forest code violations that we detected on properties that were still compliant with the soy moratorium, those 5 times more properties that were in the previous slide. So these producers could be planting soy on their older cleared areas and then moving their ranching to newly cleared areas. The areas that we detected were in violation of the forest code. In this case, the indirect land use change theory that I described previously could be taking place, but would be taking place within a single property instead of across the landscape on a larger scale. We also found that most soy producers are using multiple properties. Of the producers we talked to, 63% of them had more than one property, typically 2 or 3 properties. And this is really important because the absence of reliable and current information about land holdings in Brazil has long been a challenge for conducting detailed analysis about land users and properties in the Amazon. So that we found that 2/3 of the producers that we surveyed used multiple properties. This suggests that even though it's really important that we're now getting access to property boundaries in the Amazon through this environmental licensing program, these property boundaries may not tell us everything that we need to know about a producer's actual land resources, and this can have important implications for policy analyses. And then finally, we found that rentals are a really important land holding strategy for soy producers. 40% of the producers that we surveyed use a rented property, either exclusively or in addition to properties that they owned. They said that renting is really attractive because of the rising costs of input, like fertilizers and this kind of thing, and they're able to accommodate those rising costs without tying up all of their money in a land deal. They also said that areas suitable for growing soy are becoming prohibitively expensive, and that current owners who are mainly ranchers, are preferring not to sell their properties to them anymore. When we asked them what their landlords were up to, they said that basically most of their landlords were former ranchers who had either retired to the city or were planning to take up ranching on that property again once the lease ended and the soil was fertilized again. So this suggests a couple of an important weakness in the way, going back to our question of the soy moratorium and its effectiveness. Going back, it suggests that there's an important weakness in the way that the soy moratorium is verified. Compliance with the soy moratorium is verified. So even though the monitoring system seems to be fairly good and seems to be detecting the soy that is expanding onto deforested land, the fact that producers maybe own more than one property, and especially the fact that they may be renting properties, means that soy traders really have their work cut out trying to verify exactly where the soy that they're buying comes from. So what happens currently today is that a soy producer will go to sell his soy to the trader, and the trader will verify one property. He'll check the farmer's name and maybe the name of the farm against the blacklist, and if that property checks out, then the soy producer is allowed to sell. So in this way, he's able to launder any non-compliant soy into the main soy supply chain. Of course, our other research has shown that this is not happening very much right now, but it is an important risk, especially as changes in incentives for soy expansion, things like a fluctuating real versus the dollar, and different dynamics, different increasing demand for soy can raise the price raising the price for soy. All of these kinds of things could change the mathematics of the incentives that soy producers are navigating as they decide, should I expand, should I not expand? I don't want to dwell too much on that, but I just wanted to say that this means that regardless of the quality of the monitoring system, the verification system that the soy moratorium currently uses is limited in its ability to exclude non-compliant soy. So just to kind of sum up what all this means is that, so in our research where we were looking at property arrangements, rentals and multiple property ownership and what producers are doing on their properties, we found that all of these dynamics are fairly common in the sample that we took. And we suspect that they could be increasing in importance across the Amazon production landscape. So right now, as I mentioned, the deforestation for soy hasn't been a big problem under the soy moratorium in spite of the existence of these loopholes and these challenges. But if deforestation for soy were to increase, then these could be important risks for the future, for deforestation-free soy in the future. So soy traders could be running a big risk of their claims and their commitments that their supply chains would be free of deforestation. They could be running a risk that those commitments would actually not be upheld. More thorough verification systems on the part of soy traders, especially doing a better job to determine exactly how many properties the soy producer that they're buying from is using, would go a long way to resolving this particular loophole. We also, basically, we know that there are really complex ways, we found that there are really complex ways that producers use and hold land. What we don't know is the incidence of these or how prevalent these are across the landscape, and then also how much these, what the trend is for these. Are these kinds of property arrangements increasing? Are they decreasing? Are they pretty stable? More research is required, I think, to determine those trends. And then finally, our findings of common soy and cattle integration suggest that the soy industry's claims that simply monitoring and controlling deforestation directly caused by soy production keeps their supply chains not only free of deforestation, but also helps to actually protect the forests, may require a little bit more inspection, because although we haven't yet found any good evidence that indirect land use change across the whole production landscape is taking place, we are finding at least circumstantial evidence that's suggesting that perhaps on-property leakage or on-property displacement or deforestation could be taking place. And so if that's true, then the question is, what is the magnitude of this leakage, and if it's taking place, is this a trade-off that we're willing to make in order to arrive at what most people agree would be a more efficient use of land in the Amazon for food production, integration of soy and cattle on the same property. All right, thanks. Got a question already.
Yeah, no, I really enjoyed the presentation. I learned a lot from it. But I have a thought listening to what you're describing. It seems like one squeeze point that all soy expansions, indeed even just continuing, has to pass through every year is access to capital.
Right.
Kept mentioning that they've got to get loans out so they can get their seed and their pesticides and herbicides, what have you. I'm wondering if there's been any thought about trying to intervene there as well as with the soy trading, where putting strictures on the banking industry and saying, no, if they're doing illegal rainforest stuff, you can't give them capital and we're going to fine you if you do.
Yes, that is happening. So there, any bank that uses an official credit line that's subsidized by the Brazilian government, there was a law passed in 2008 that requires a certain amount of environmental kind of due diligence before the loan can go through. Those loans also face similar verification problems as the ones I described for the soy moratorium and the traders.
Is everybody using the same verifier then?
So there's,
so you still have the problem of somebody doing it on an additional property.
Right.
But presumably the bank must know about that on additional property because they're just giving out one big packet of loan?
Yeah, well, in some cases, like a big producer will have resources to cover some of his production, but he won't be able to, he'll need to finance a part of his production. And so he'll be able to sort of shelter it all within the confines of one property. So he's able to then basically displace his personal financing onto the dirty property and then only finance the clean property. So that's one issue. And then another issue is that besides the soy moratorium requirements, the banks are also, the law I was referring to actually refers to the Brazilian government's own blacklist, which I didn't talk about in this presentation, but when they find illegal deforestation with their environmental police, they place that property or part of that property on a public embargo list, which you can go look up on the internet. The problem is that list is not super easy to use because in some places the information is incomplete, and in other cases the property isn't even, so the Brazilian government only manages to find about half of the illegal deforestation and assign an embargo to it. And so we've been doing different analyses to look at that, and Ian here in the audience is an expert on that. And so they have problems with the lists being incomplete, and they have problems with the producers being able to sort of work the system and wander.
One last quick follow-up, which is also wondering if the incentives are perverse the way this is set up, because both banks and the traders both want soy.
Yeah, this is true.
Have anybody looked into that issue? Or Fox guarding chicken coop, as it were? No?
Right, well, yeah, that's definitely a problem.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Do you share the perspective? Soy exploded in recent decades, and this was triggered mainly by consumption in China.
So the soy expansion, the soy boom period in Brazil took place before China was purchasing large amounts of soy, but China has definitely changed the game in terms of the volume. Yeah.
The other thing that's my notion is that the consequences that will be the larger, more to Brazil, we all know what it is. I heard that in Brazil the black beans have become a bit scarcer, or their feijoada, they were not, it's largely that. And my own experience, having lived in El Salvador half a century ago, we ate black beans 3 times a day. And they were, however, in Costa Rica. They had a dish they called the gallo pinto, had nothing to do with chicken.
Right.
It was a mixture of black beans with rice. Well, 30 years later, when I got back to El Salvador, here it was mixed black beans with rice, and no longer the black beans by themselves. My suspicion, this is another one of those consequences of scarcity of black beans, which cannot survive the competition against the monstrous soy. Is there something to that?
Well, most of the black beans in Brazil are not produced in the Amazon.
Yes, that's true.
And
yeah.
so I think that there's competition among beans and corn and soy in the south of Brazil and in the Cerrado where black beans are produced. Yeah. Yeah.
Could you speak to some of the dynamics of power between various actors involved here? You mentioned soy growers who are ranging from 200 to 10,000 hectares. Are they all speaking with one voice? Likely not. So what are the relationships between soy growers and how much power does soy as an industry wield, in Brazil compared to other commodity actors?
Yeah. So the soy industry wields a lot of power in Brazil. That the agricultural sector in general has a voting bloc basically in Congress, and they've been able to make a lot of changes to the forest code and block a lot of legislation and push different kinds of legislation forward. And so in that sense, the soy industry is very part of that. So in that sense, the soy industry has a ton of power. In terms of the producers acting as as one voice or not, in some ways they do, and in some ways they don't. But larger producers definitely have a lot more power in terms of their ability. They have personal power that is mostly affects themselves. They have a lot more capital, and they're able to then parlay that capital into better rates on loans and better access to buyers and this kind of thing. They're also able to. They're also able to. So according to the people we talk to in the field, they're able to get away with a lot more. For example, if there's an illegal, if they deforest an area illegally, they're able to either, supposedly, I don't know if this is true, these could be rumors, but they say that they're able to pay off the environmental police, or they're able to use the lawyers to resolve the fine in courts later and alleviate themselves of the burden of being caught illegally deforesting, whereas a small producer simply doesn't have those kinds of resources. Yeah.
I was listening to the next question that we didn't touch on that right now. You're kind of getting close to the question of corruption. And in the scheme of things that you were talking about, in terms of how do we know that the soy moratorium worked? How do we know that the traders really purchased the soy from clean farms?
Right.
Is there word, or is there any procedure to verify that? That's number one.
Yeah.
Let me just have a couple more questions and put them all on the
Okay.
table and then touch everything you want to. In research that I did about this question, I ran into a statement that, in fact, it is only establishing native reservations that protects area completely from deforestation, because this is where you cannot get a business license.
Right.
And that the amount of native reservations increased enormously from the previous government to this one, something like 20 times.
Right.
Right, from 100 something to below 20.
Right.
So what's your view of this statement in terms of deforestation and soil dynamics?
Right.
And then the third thing I wanted you to touch upon a little bit is, how did you work? You said we several times when you talked about your field work. Who's we?
Okay.
How many people did this research? How did you guys do it?
Okay, I'll work backwards. We, as a team, Ian who just left, Holly was here, we do work that involves satellite images and this kind of thing together as a group. And so in some cases, I think we in that way. And then we in the field include me and a couple of field assistants, these guys that I hired to work with me in Brazil before. I don't typically go around by myself. As far as the reserves go, I think you're right. They have been rescinding reserve status. I don't engage with that much because there just aren't that many nature or conservation reserves in Mato Grosso where I work. So it's a little, I know a little bit less about that. And then finally, the way that we know that the traders are complying with their word so far is that when we map soy area and deforestation, we see that there's not really much opportunity for them to be buying dirty soy. And so the loopholes that we're finding are kind of for the future if the incentives for expansion and the risk, other dampers on deforestation kind of decrease, then they may start buying dirty soy either cynically on purpose or accidentally. Sabrina.
Following up on
Yeah.
corruption,
Yeah.
It's nice and beautiful that all these laws and agreements are put in place in Brazil and so on. But then there is the other issue of vetting and verification and checking,
Right.
which is not my field, but I understand it's very, very lacking. So it only adds to the problem,
Right.
not to mention I'm just back from Brazil, not to mention the current disbelief among the population that anything coming from Brazil is right, correct. It's just 11 months between one trip and the other. It is very, very noticeable, this total distrust.
Right.
So taking all of this into account, and you said that the moratorium expires this May,
Yeah.
so 2 months from now.
Right.
So are there like plans, are there groups working to extend it for an extension?
There are. Basically all of the big soy companies have commitments that they're going to stay deforestation free. And so the question is like, will they, the last time they renewed it, it was at the last minute. It was like 1 day from expiring and then they decided they were going to renew it. And so the question is, will they renew it at the last minute?
They use Congress?
No, the soy moratorium is just by the traders, the soy traders. These are companies. So they're waiting around for the Brazilian government to get its act together and enforce laws in a way that make them feel like they can tell their customers their soy is free of deforestation without them having to do the work themselves. But I don't think anyone really thinks the Brazilian government is quite at that point where they're effectively enforcing laws and effectively ensuring that illegal deforestation isn't taking place.
And then we've got Veil at the head of the,
Right.
I don't know.
Yeah, right. I will say that everything you're saying is correct and rings true with my experiences, but I will say that in terms of forest monitoring so far, INPE is not seen to be corrupt. Like I've never heard anyone say that INPE is lying or cooking books or anything like this. And so I think that in that sense, the monitoring is probably accurate. People have a lot of bad things to say about IBAMA and about other agencies that soy producers interact with, but most people pretty much, even soy producers, are like, well, INPE can see everything. Yeah.
Question for you about indirect land use change. It's actually a topic I'm working on as well.
Oh, cool.
And one of the solutions that's been offered is to avoid this displacement effect of soy triggering cattle into forests. Let's identify unused or marginal land around the world,
Right.
plant soy there so there is none of this displacement. I'm curious in your thoughts on this approach. Do you think that's an effective strategy?
I mean, it sounds like it has a lot of merit. I think that what seems like an effective strategy from the outside, like if you have to imagine like who is the person that's going to be planting the soy, and if a soy producer has invested a lot of money in a rental contract or purchasing a soy property that's not marginal, for him, he's not going to be in favor of that kind of strategy. And so I think that I think that those kinds of strategies are really important to think about, but they have to keep in mind the incentives that are already at play on the ground and how you would have to overcome really considerable kind of path dependencies in the way that soy is expanding now. I think, if you want to leave, you can leave. I'll answer Ian's question.
I was wondering, since you've been now going to Mato Grosso for several years, if you've seen changes in land tenure arrangements because when my stuff was sugarcane,
Yeah.
I saw a lot of companies adopting an economy of scale model. Some of them own like 90% of their own land devoted to sugarcane,
Yeah.
and others would rent out a lot.
Yeah.
And there was actually quite a bit of variation in it, and some people I talked to said, we own most of our land now, but pretty soon.
That's kind of distally located or far away from the original expansion of the soy area, but the evidence is a little bit unclear. Important questions that have to be resolved to really answer this question include, where did the cattle that were previously using a new soy area go? Did the owner move his ranching? Did the owner actually move his ranching operation to the frontier? Did he consolidate onto some other area that he was already using and maybe increase the stocking rate, thereby not causing indirect deforestation? Did he stop ranching altogether? These are questions that we still have to answer. So that's kind of the state of the science at the landscape level as far as the soy moratorium, to explain really well how, in fact, that's happening to either maintain the soy moratorium in the future or to inform whatever kinds of policies might be put into place to replace it. Doing this required zooming in to see exactly what producers are up to. And so this means that most of the results for the final part of this talk and for this particular phase of our research is coming from field interviews. And so far, since we've been going out into the field periodically since 2013, and so far we've talked to 100 producers, or 100 people, about 88 producers, in these 4 municipalities here in this part of Mato Grosso. Primarily because I used to live in the middle of this yellow part, and I wanted to see what was going on here in these areas where soy is more rapidly expanding. Here is a fairly consolidated area. There's not that much land use change taking place. Soy properties that we visited ranged from about 200 hectares to over 10,000 hectares, to give you a sense of the scope, the scale of production that we're talking about. These are really enormous farms. In fact, a 200 hectare farm can barely make a living producing soy in the Amazon. So then the next phase of our research, we wanted to try to understand, going back to that finding that 5 times the number of soy farmers violated the forest code than violated the soy moratorium. We wanted to try to understand what on earth those producers were doing with that area. If they were clearing it and not using it for soy production, what in the world were they doing? And then we also wanted to try to understand a little bit more how soy farmers are experiencing the emergence and implementation of all these new requirements from the people that buy their soy. Are they just complying? How do they find out what the requirements are? Do they have other strategies and options that aren't accounted for under the type of governance that controls land use for soy production? Just basically kind of getting at how do we better explain the process by which the landscape level results that we're seeing are taking place from a producer perspective. And then we were hoping that all of this information would give us a little bit more insight into how durable the soy moratorium is, or how durable the concept of keeping the soy supply chain free of deforestation might be. These questions are all particularly important right now because the soy moratorium is set to expire in May of 2016. So if the soy moratorium is indeed playing this really key role in reducing deforestation, we need to be able